People laughed when an old, dusty pickup truck rolled onto the sleek tarmac at LA's Sky Park. Amid the glittering line of limousines and glossy SUVs that usually carried Hollywood royalty and elite executives, the rusty Ford seemed like someone's idea of a practical joke. The executives inside the terminal building shook their heads, muttering quietly to one another, amused yet dismissive. They'd called for a mechanic, someone professional and capable, but as soon as they saw this ragged truck appear, they couldn't help but smirk at the thought that anyone in such a sorry vehicle might fix anything, much less a multi-million-dollar private jet belonging to Hollywood's favorite star, Madison Brooks. The terminal buzzed with hushed laughter as managers and assistants stole glances out the tinted glass. A few security guards, arms crossed and eyebrows raised, stood silently amused. Cameras in the hands of curious employees discreetly filmed the shabby arrival, betting this would become another hilarious blooper to pass around at company parties. But one person stood quietly apart, unamused and deeply focused: Madison herself. Madison Brooks was no ordinary celebrity. She had won Oscars, graced the covers of countless magazines, and had recently stepped confidently into directing and producing blockbusters that set new box office records. She was Hollywood's most formidable force, celebrated and envied, known for perfectionism and a relentless drive that turned projects into gold. Yet here she was, caught up in an emergency that no amount of wealth or influence could quickly fix. Her jet had malfunctioned unexpectedly, grounding her just before a critical overseas film premiere. Madison had no time for delays, and certainly no patience for incompetence. As the laughter continued inside the terminal, the driver of the battered pickup stepped onto the runway. His name was Jake Rollins, and nothing about him matched the polished image of the corporate types gawking at him. Jake was a simple mechanic who spent his days in a modest garage on the edge of town. He wasn't famous or wealthy. He never aspired to be anything beyond reliable and good at his job. He was quiet, efficient, and utterly uninterested in impressing anyone. Jake walked straight toward the jet without even glancing at the crowd behind the glass. He had been called urgently, a phone call before sunrise, offering generous pay for immediate work. No explanation, just urgency. He didn't mind. He knew his work and trusted his hands more than anything else in the world. When Jake reached the jet, he calmly placed his toolbox down, ignoring the eyes that scrutinized him from afar. He wasn't oblivious to their judgment. He simply chose not to acknowledge it. To Jake, people's opinions mattered far less than what was wrong with the plane. That was his sole focus now. He lifted the panel to examine the jet's engine and quickly realized why they'd called him with such urgency. The issue wasn't minor or cosmetic. It was serious, a dangerous failure that could have catastrophic consequences if not fixed immediately. Jake knew jets, engines, and machinery like he knew breathing, and the sight before him was shocking even to his experienced eyes. Someone had been dangerously negligent. A fuel line had nearly melted through, hanging dangerously close to critical electrical parts. Any spark and the plane could explode. The laughter from the terminal building faded in Jake's ears. In that moment, he blocked out everything except the task at hand. Lives depended on his ability to act quickly and decisively. Jake moved swiftly, every gesture precise, without hesitation or second guessing. He reached into his toolbox, pulling out specialized tools, parts, and clamps he always kept ready for emergencies like this, emergencies others dismissed until it was too late. Inside, the executives' amusement began to falter. Their smugness turned slowly to curiosity, and then into something resembling awe. Their whispers became uncertain, nervous even. Nobody expected Jake, the guy from the shabby pickup, to actually touch the jet, let alone fix it. And yet, they watched in disbelief as he continued his work, a performance of skill and mastery none of them had ever witnessed so close before. Madison watched Jake through narrowed eyes. She saw beyond the faded jeans and grease-stained jacket. She saw something that everyone else around her had missed: a man with clarity of purpose and exceptional competence. Madison Brooks had been surrounded by people who spoke beautifully but delivered poorly. She'd met countless individuals in tailored suits, fluent in promises but lacking in substance. Jake was different. He hadn't said a single unnecessary word, yet he had already spoken volumes through his quiet, determined action. Minutes passed rapidly as Jake worked diligently, his movements steady and deliberate, his concentration absolute. The executives behind the glass had gone completely silent. Their jokes evaporated, replaced by anxious glances and whispered speculation about what exactly was happening on that runway. Then, unexpectedly, and with perfect timing, the jet's engines roared softly to life. The low hum was clear, consistent, and confident, the unmistakable sound of something powerful being restored by capable hands. A wave of astonishment spread instantly across the observers inside the terminal. People exchanged stunned looks, their amusement forgotten. Jake had fixed the impossible, and he'd done it faster and better than anyone imagined possible. Madison Brooks, calm and self-assured, stepped away from the observers, walking deliberately toward the runway. Her staff and colleagues stood frozen in shock, eyes wide as she moved past them without explanation. No one dared to follow, caught unsure of what was about to unfold. She reached Jake, the man whose name she barely knew, whose life she knew nothing about, whose world was as far from her own as it could possibly be. Yet in that moment, Madison saw clearly what no amount of fame, power, or wealth could buy. She saw integrity and genuine strength. Standing face to face, Madison knew exactly what she wanted to do next, even though it would defy all logic, expectation, and common sense. She knew her decision would stun everyone, but for the first time in years, Madison Brooks didn't care about perception or reputation. Right there, in front of a stunned and speechless crowd, Madison prepared herself to ask Jake the one question nobody, including herself, had expected she would ever utter. It was 6:47 a.m. when Jake Rollins pulled into Clearwater International Airport, the sky still heavy with the bruised colors of a fading dawn. The early morning air felt sharp, cutting through the remnants of sleep clinging to him. His boots hit the tarmac with steady purpose, each step toward the sleek, grounded jet punctuated by the distant roar of departing flights overhead. The call had come before sunrise, just as he was finishing his second cup of cheap coffee. No details, no pleasantries. Just an address, a simple urgent jet failure, and the promise of a fast payout. Jake didn't ask questions. He never did. Not when the work mattered. He tossed his kit into the back of the truck, fired up the reluctant engine, and pointed his headlights into the early dark. Now, standing a few feet from the massive silver jet that shimmered under the harsh floodlights, Jake knew this wasn't some quick patch job. This was serious. The aircraft looked perfect on the outside, gleaming, prestigious, untouched by anything resembling urgency or danger. But looks meant nothing to a mechanic who had spent his life pulling miracles out of machines everyone else had given up on. The suits were already there, clustered like birds behind the glass of the terminal building. They barely acknowledged him as he crossed the tarmac, their conversations muffled by thick walls and thicker arrogance. A few gave half-hearted glances, quick dismissive flicks of the eyes before turning back to their polished screens and disposable coffee cups. Their laughter floated faintly through the air, carried by the early morning breeze. Jake set his toolbox down beside the nose of the plane and popped open the engine panel. He didn't need long. One glance told him everything. The fuel line was a disaster. Not just cracked, it had melted in places, insulation peeled away like dead skin. The clamp supposed to hold it secure was corroded, rotting quietly where no one had bothered to check. Worse, the fuel had already started to leak, seeping closer and closer to the ignition coils. One spark, and this whole pristine bird would have gone up in flames. Jake didn't waste time cursing the incompetence that had let it come this far. He didn't pause to wonder who had last signed off on this jet's maintenance. None of that mattered now. The only thing that mattered was fixing it before the next mistake became the last one. He grabbed the replacement hose from his kit, a clamp, a torch, and a roll of high-grade insulating tape. His hands moved fast, automatic, confident, the result of years fixing broken engines on highways, in fields, in backwater garages where second chances were rare and mistakes were final. Behind the glass, a few of the executives had taken out their phones, recording quietly. Maybe they thought they were capturing the beginning of a train wreck. Maybe they thought they'd be sending around a funny video of some scruffy nobody fumbling around an engine he didn't understand. Jake didn't notice. If he had, he wouldn't have cared. Inside the terminal, Madison Brooks stood alone. arms folded loosely, staring through the massive windows. She said nothing, as her entourage muttered and snickered around her. She didn't need anyone to interpret what she was seeing. She understood jets better than most pilots. She had flown them, raced them, supervised their construction. And what she saw through the glass left her strangely unsettled. The mechanic outside didn't move like someone who was guessing or bluffing his way through a job. There was no hesitation, no panic, no fake showmanship for the crowd. He worked like a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Every decision was precise, every motion deliberate. She watched as he tightened the new clamp into place, replaced the compromised lines, checked connections twice without even looking rushed. In her experience, even seasoned engineers missed things under pressure. But not him. Then, just as she leaned closer to the glass, the jet's lights flickered on. It started faint, like a pulse deep in the machine's heart, steady and strong. The hum grew louder, surer, spreading through the aircraft's massive frame. The entire jet seemed to breathe again. Inside, the shift in atmosphere was palpable. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Laughter evaporated. Coffee cups were lowered. Phones were slipped back into pockets. Someone muttered under their breath, astonished, unable to look away. "That should have taken hours," one executive whispered, eyes wide. Jake didn't hear it. He had already wiped his hands on a rag and closed the engine panel with a solid thud. No dramatic gestures, no acknowledgement of the stunned silence behind the glass. He slung his bag over his shoulder and turned back toward his truck, ready to leave without so much as a second glance. The job was done. That was all that mattered. But before he could reach the end of the runway, the jet's main door began to lower. The mechanical whir of the stairs unfolding broke the strange, reverent silence that had fallen over the tarmac. Jake paused, not out of curiosity, but because the movement caught the corner of his vision. He didn't expect anyone to come out. In all his years patching up vehicles and machines, no one had ever left a warm terminal just to thank the guy who fixed the problem. Yet down the steps came Madison Brooks, her stride unhurried but unmistakable. The executives inside the terminal didn't move. They watched, frozen, as the biggest star they represented walked right past them all. Past the junior engineers, past the handlers and the PR managers and the strategists whispering frantic warnings into earpieces. She walked straight toward Jake, and every person watching knew, without anyone saying a word, that something extraordinary was about to happen. Jake didn't move as Madison approached. He didn't shift his weight, didn't fidget with the rag still clenched in his hand. He simply stood there, calm and steady, as one of the most recognizable faces in the world closed the distance between them. Madison stopped a few feet from him, her sharp gaze steady. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The hum of the jet behind them filled the heavy morning air. Somewhere beyond the terminal glass, a phone clattered to the floor, the sound muffled but noticeable. "You fixed it," Madison said quietly. Jake nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." "You didn't just fix it. You saved it." She spoke with a certainty that brokered no argument. "My pilot told me the engine was compromised beyond repair, said we would have to ground it for at least a week." Jake kept his voice even. He missed a melted fuel line. It was nearly touching the ignition coil. Her eyes flickered with realization, but there was no anger, no defensiveness, only sharp understanding. "You could have walked away," she said after a beat. "I don't walk away from fire hazards," Jake answered simply. There was a silence between them then, not uncomfortable, but charged, like the moment before lightning strikes. Madison studied him, truly studied him, the way she might size up a script or a co-star, weighing authenticity against appearances. Then a faint smile crossed her face, not the rehearsed kind she wore for cameras, but something smaller, quieter, real. "Do you know who I am?" she asked, almost curious. Jake gave a small shrug. "Madison Brooks, Sky Park Aviation's prize account, queen of the box office, face on half the billboards from here to Times Square." "You don't seem impressed." "I'm not here to be impressed," Jake said. "I'm here to fix problems." Inside the terminal, every pair of eyes pressed closer to the glass. Staff, executives, maintenance crews, they were all craning their necks, whispering theories, watching history quietly unfold right in front of them. Madison glanced once toward the terminal, then back at Jake. Without warning, her voice cut through the morning air, firm and clear. "Everyone inside, now." The command left no room for argument. Assistants scrambled. The suits fumbled with phones and coffee cups, vanishing behind the sliding glass doors. In seconds, Jake and Madison were alone on the vast stretch of tarmac. Madison's voice softened slightly when she spoke again. "I've spent my entire life surrounded by men who talk big and do little," she said. "You're the first one who did the opposite." Jake said nothing. He didn't need to. His job was done, the plane was alive, and the truth of what had just happened spoke louder than any words. Madison stood still for a moment, as if weighing something far heavier than the situation in front of them. She took a slow breath, eyes never leaving his. Then she stepped closer. "What would you do," she said carefully, "if someone like me asked you something completely insane?" Jake didn't flinch. "Depends," he said, his voice even. "How insane are we talking?" She hesitated just a fraction, and then, in the same voice she once used to close multi-million-dollar deals, she said, "What if I asked you to marry me?" The world seemed to go silent. Beyond the runway, somewhere in the parking lot, a car alarm went off in the distance. A gull screamed overhead. The engines of another jet spooled down slowly. Jake didn't laugh. He didn't smirk. He didn't dismiss it as some rich girl's joke. He just stood there, steady as ever, eyes locked on Madison's, searching for the truth inside her words. Most men would have stumbled over themselves to respond, tried to turn the moment into a clever line, or acted like they were being pranked. But Jake Rollins had spent too much time fixing what other people abandoned. He understood the difference between noise and meaning. This wasn't noise. Madison waited, holding her ground in a way that suggested she wasn't used to waiting long for anything. Her question hung between them, bold and improbable, suspended in the humid morning air. Jake wiped his palm against the rag hanging from his belt, not because he was nervous, but because old habits died hard. "You don't even know me," Jake said eventually, voice low. "That's why I'm asking," Madison said. Jake raised an eyebrow, skeptical but not dismissive. "Come again?" She stepped closer. "I've been proposed to 23 times. I counted. Men in suits, men with yachts, men with memorized talking points about my net worth." Her voice dipped. "They memorized my brand and called it love. But you walked into a nightmare with a wrench, saved my jet, risked your life, and asked for nothing in return." Jake shook his head slowly. "I didn't do it for you." "I know," she whispered. "That's why it's real." Jake looked down, not out of bashfulness, but to process the sheer absurdity and the strange gravity of what she was offering. His boots were worn, his jeans were stained, and the only thing he owned with any shine left on it was the wrench in his back pocket. "You want to marry a mechanic?" he asked bluntly. "I want to marry the only man who didn't try to impress me." Behind them, beyond the closed terminal doors, faces pressed against the glass. Whispers bloomed like wildfire across the tarmac. Phones surely captured every second. Madison didn't care. Jake looked at her for a long, measured moment, then said, "If you're serious, take off your shoes." Madison blinked, surprised. "If you're serious," Jake repeated, "take off your shoes. Walk with me. 5 minutes. No titles. No headlines. Just two people. Same ground." She hesitated for a second. Only a second. Then, without breaking eye contact, she leaned against one foot and kicked off one heel. Then the other. Barefoot on sun-baked concrete, Madison Brooks followed Jake Rollins across the empty runway, leaving behind the world she had built, walking toward something she couldn't name but knew she needed more than anything. Jake didn't rush. He walked at an easy pace, his boots scuffing quietly against the concrete. Madison stayed close behind him, her bare feet hitting the warm ground without hesitation. They moved past the jet, past the tidy lines of private planes gleaming in the morning light, past the places where handlers and managers would normally swarm. Out here, there were no flashing cameras, no carefully curated appearances. Just two people, walking without a script. He led her toward the far side of the airfield, to a corner most visitors never noticed. An old hangar stood there, tucked behind rows of newer, flashier buildings. The metal siding was rusted and dented, the paint long since faded to a dull memory of its original color. Jake grabbed the heavy door and tugged it open with a loud scrape. He stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter first. Madison glanced once at the battered frame, then ducked inside without a word. The hangar was almost empty. No polished floors, no bright lights, just a battered folding table, a lone metal chair, and walls lined with old photographs. Grainy snapshots of planes, engines, and a young boy standing beside a smiling man in grease-stained coveralls. Jake followed her in and let the door drift shut behind them. The air inside was cooler, quieter, thick with the smell of old metal and engine oil. "My father built his life fixing engines," Jake said, voice low but steady. "Taught me that no machine's too far gone if you're willing to get your hands dirty." Madison walked slowly along the wall, her fingers skimming the air just above the rows of photographs. "I watched him bring planes back from the dead," Jake continued. "Ones other men said weren't worth saving. He didn't have degrees or shiny tools, just grit." He moved toward the folding table, setting down his tool bag with a soft clunk. "When he passed, this hangar was all he left me. No big inheritance, no secret trust fund, just a broken door, bad wiring, and a promise that dreams don't run on electricity." Jake leaned against the wall, crossing his arms loosely. "I kept this place because it reminded me what matters." Madison turned slowly, facing him fully now. "Every man you've met," Jake said, not accusing, just stating a fact, "wanted your empire, your brand, your crown." He shrugged once. "I don't care about that. I don't care if you lose it all tomorrow. I'm not here for the empire." Madison didn't smile. She didn't need to. Her entire posture said everything. Jake pushed away from the wall and walked closer, standing a few feet away. "If you're serious," he said, voice even, "don't expect champagne. Don't expect fireworks. Expect scraped knuckles, midnight repairs, meals eaten sitting on toolboxes." He waited, letting the truth hang between them like a weight. Madison finally nodded once, slow and deliberate. "That sounds perfect," she said simply. For the first time that morning, Jake let a slow, genuine smile cross his face. Not because he was charmed, not because he thought this was some grand fairy tale, but because he believed her. They stood there in the quiet, in a place built not for glamour, but for grit, and made a choice no one else in their worlds would ever understand. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the old hangar door against its frame. Inside, everything stayed still. As the minutes slipped by, sunlight began to creep through the high, dirty windows, casting long beams across the cracked concrete floor. Madison didn't seem to notice. She sat down cross-legged on the ground near the folding table, her designer dress pooling beside her like an afterthought. Jake grabbed 2 chipped coffee mugs from a crate, poured strong black coffee from a thermos, and handed her one without ceremony. They drank in silence, the old, easy kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled. Somewhere far across the airfield, the terminal bustled back to life. Phones rang, news outlets speculated. Managers scrambled to spin a story they didn't understand. Jake and Madison ignored it all. The empire could wait. The world could wait. Right now, in a forgotten hangar that smelled like grease and history, Madison Brooks and Jake Rollins sat side by side, drinking terrible coffee out of battered mugs, beginning a life that didn't need headlines or hashtags to be real. And for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, nothing felt missing. The following morning, the sun poured through the dusty windows of the old hangar, streaking the cracked floor with long golden lines. Madison sat cross-legged near the folding table, wearing Jake's oversized flannel shirt. Her designer dress lay folded neatly beside her, forgotten. She cradled a chipped coffee mug in her hands, sipping slowly, the strong, burnt taste grounding her more than any 5-star breakfast ever had. Jake sat across from her, a wrench in his hand, working quietly on a battered old carburetor. He didn't look up when he spoke. "You really stayed," he said, like he hadn't quite expected it, but wasn't surprised either. "I said I would," Madison answered simply. Most people would have called a driver, booked a suite at the nearest luxury hotel, and vanished back into their safe, polished world. Madison didn't. She stayed in the hangar with the cracked walls and the creaking beams, sitting on the hard concrete floor as if it were the most natural place in the world. "I already know what 5 stars feel like," she said after a while. "I wanted to see what 5 a.m. with you felt like." Jake chuckled low under his breath, tightening a bolt with careful precision. "It's loud, it smells like grease, and it starts with bad coffee and cold feet." Madison raised her mug in a mock toast. Outside, the rest of the world was spinning out of control. News of her disappearance had spread like wildfire overnight. Paparazzi clustered outside the airport. Shareholders demanded statements. Madison's name trended worldwide, hashtags stacking up by the minute. Some reports claimed she'd been kidnapped. Others insisted it was a publicity stunt. A grainy security video leaked, showing a barefoot Madison walking across the tarmac beside a man in oil-stained jeans. The internet exploded with theories, memes, and speculation. No one knew where she was. Not her manager, not her publicist, not even her closest friends. Inside the boardroom of Carter Aviation, chaos reigned. Jason Lancaster, Madison's chief operating officer and longtime advisor, stood at the head of the long glass table, red-faced and furious. "This is unacceptable," he barked, slamming a folder onto the table. "We have journalists camping outside, investors panicking, the board demanding emergency meetings. She's missing, and not one of you can tell me where she is." Around the table, executives shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. A few mumbled half-hearted excuses. One younger assistant, brave or foolish, leaned in. "Sir, what if," he began carefully, "what if she's just choosing love?" Jason scoffed so hard the entire table seemed to vibrate. "She's a Brooks," he snapped. "Brooks don't chase love, they build empires." Silence fell. No one dared argue, except one. At the far end of the table, Evelyn Hartley, Madison's godmother and unofficial guardian since childhood, stirred her tea slowly. She said nothing. She didn't need to. She had seen Madison grow up behind velvet ropes and locked gates, seen the birthdays spent alone, the laughter faked for cameras, the smiles practiced until they cracked. And now, for the first time in years, Madison wasn't performing. Evelyn allowed herself a tiny hidden smile as she lifted her teacup to her lips. Back at the airfield, Jake and Madison worked side by side. They weren't fixing jets or restoring multi-million-dollar toys. They were working on an old Cessna that Jake had been tinkering with for years. A plane that most people would have scrapped without a second thought. Jake handed Madison a socket wrench. She took it without hesitation, her manicured hands already smudged with oil and grime. She didn't flinch when the grease stained her skin. She laughed when Jake teased her for stripping a bolt. She leaned into the work like she'd been waiting her whole life for something this real. No one mentioned brands. No one talked about headlines. They just moved together, fixing something broken because it deserved to fly again. By late afternoon, a black SUV pulled up at the far gate of the airfield. Jake noticed first. His body stiffened, shoulders tightening almost imperceptibly. Madison stood, wiping her hands on a rag, recognizing the vehicle instantly. Jason stepped out, his suit immaculate despite the summer heat. He looked around with disdain before walking briskly toward the hangar. "Miss Brooks," he called out, voice smooth and rehearsed. "I'm relieved to see you well." Madison didn't smile. She waited for him to reach her before speaking. "Jason," she said coolly, "what brings you here?" "You have the world panicking," Jason said, flashing a tight, insincere smile. "Your jet missed its departure. The media is in a frenzy. I'm here to escort you back to reality." She didn't flinch. "You mean your version of it," Madison replied. Jason's eyes flicked to Jake, barely masking his disdain. "And who's he?" Jason asked sharply. Jake stepped forward without hesitation. "Just the guy who kept her jet from blowing up," he said. Jason let out a short, incredulous laugh. "And now you think that qualifies you to stand next to her?" Madison's voice cut through the air, calm and deadly sharp. "I don't need qualifications to choose who I stand next to." Jason opened his mouth, trying to regain control. "There are investors watching, Madison. Your career." "My name is Madison," she said, stepping closer, her voice firm. "Not a brand, not a commodity, just Madison." Jason looked helpless for the first time in a decade. He saw it slipping, the control, the narrative, the empire. Madison turned to Jake. "Come with me," she said simply. Jake hesitated for half a second, then nodded. She reached out her hand. This time, he took it. The doors of the hangar swung wide open. Outside, cameras clicked like firecrackers. Reporters shouted questions, microphones thrust forward like weapons. Madison didn't falter. Hand in hand with Jake Rollins, she walked straight into the blinding afternoon sun, into the frenzy of the world she once ruled, no longer hiding, no longer pretending. And the world, for one breathless moment, forgot how to breathe. The afternoon sun blazed down, cameras flashing, voices shouting, but Madison didn't slow her pace. Jake matched her stride without hesitation, the grease still fresh on his hands. his shirt marked with work and dust. They didn't stop for the reporters, didn't flinch at the barrage of questions. They just kept moving, side by side, leaving the stunned faces of executives and handlers in their wake. Jason watched from the tinted window of his SUV, his fingers tapping an erratic rhythm against the steering wheel. His jaw clenched tighter with every step Madison took away from everything he had carefully constructed around her. He had seen her polished, rehearsed, calculated. This was something else entirely. This was Madison choosing chaos over control, heart over strategy. He could hear his own warnings echoing from their last frantic phone call. You can't just throw it all away for some mechanic. He had barked into the receiver. What about your future? Your legacy? Madison hadn't argued. She hadn't yelled. She had simply hung up. Now, standing there under the merciless sun, Jake and Madison reached the steps of the gleaming jet she had once flown across continents to chase success. The same jet he had saved from disaster less than 24 hours ago. Jake slowed, glancing sideways at her. Are you sure about this? He asked, his voice low. Madison turned toward him. Steady. I've never been more sure of anything. Jake nodded once, and together they climbed the steps, the shouts from the crowd fading behind them as the door swung shut with a final, resolute thud. Inside, the cabin was cool and quiet, untouched by the storm raging outside. The engines rumbled to life beneath them, the vibrations steady and reassuring. Madison sank into one of the wide leather seats, exhaling slowly. Jake dropped into the seat across from her, a purring, his hands loose in his lap. The pilot's voice crackled through the intercom. Destination, ma'am. Madison looked out the window for a moment, watching the small figures on the tarmac shrinking further away. Wherever life takes us, she said clearly. The engines roared louder, the jet surging forward. Within seconds, the wheels lifted off the ground, and they were airborne, slicing through the clear blue sky, leaving behind the chaos, the questions, the world that once held her captive. Madison turned her head to Jake, catching his gaze across the cabin. He didn't look like the men she had spent her life surrounded by. He didn't have a tailored suit, a rehearsed smile, or a trophy background. He had calloused hands, a stubborn way of seeing things, and an honesty that refused to hide behind polish. And that was exactly why she had chosen him. Below them, the city sprawled out in endless concrete and ambition. Headlines buzzed across news feeds. Madison Brooks missing. Hollywood star abandons career? Barefoot runaway, the mechanic, and the millionaire. None of it mattered. She wasn't missing. She wasn't lost. For the first time in her life, Madison Brooks was exactly where she wanted to be. Jake leaned back in his seat, watching her with an unreadable expression. He didn't ask questions. He didn't press. He just let her be. Madison smiled, a small, real thing, and closed her eyes, letting the hum of the jet cradle her. The world might never understand what had happened on that runway, why a woman who had everything gave it all up for a man with grease on his hands and no interest in fame. But Madison didn't need them to understand. She understood, and Jake understood. That was enough. The jet climbed higher, punching through the thin veil of clouds, rising into the open, endless blue. Below them, the empire Madison had spent a lifetime building grew smaller and smaller until it was just a distant memory. Ahead of them stretched something new, something real. Not a carefully crafted future designed by agents and publicists, not a golden cage built of expectations, but something messy, unpredictable, imperfect, something true. Madison Brooks didn't know exactly where they were going or what the road ahead would look like. There would be no red carpets waiting, no choreographed interviews, no guarantees. All she knew was that she would be walking it barefoot if she had to, side by side with the only man who saw her before the world told him who she was supposed to be. And that was enough. That was everything. The jet soared higher, slicing through layers of cloud until the earth below blurred into colors without edges. Madison sat quietly, her head leaning against the back of the chair, her eyes half closed. Jake didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was a kind of understanding that didn't require words. Hours passed in a strange kind of suspension. No phone calls, no schedules, no negotiations. Just the steady thrum of engines and the open sky unfolding ahead. When they finally landed, it wasn't at some glittering international airport or private resort. The pilot touched down on a small rural airstrip in the middle of nowhere, a speck of cracked asphalt surrounded by endless stretches of wild grass and blue sky. Jake stood first, slinging his worn backpack over his shoulder. Madison followed without question, barefoot again, her heels tucked under her arm. She didn't ask where they were. She didn't need to know. They walked away from the plane without fanfare. No paparazzi, no managers, no one to tell them what came next. Just the sound of gravel crunching underfoot and the wide open quiet of a world too big to control. A battered old truck waited at the edge of the strip, sun-faded and faithful. Jake tossed his bag into the bed and opened the passenger door for her. Madison climbed in without hesitation. They drove in silence at first, the windows rolled down, warm air whipping past them. Eventually, Jake spoke, his voice casual. "You don't have to stay." Madison smiled faintly. "I'm not going anywhere." He nodded once, as if he'd expected that, as if somewhere deep down he already knew. They turned off the main road, following a dirt path that wound through low hills and broken fences. In the distance, a farmhouse stood crooked against the horizon, its paint peeling, its roof sagging slightly under the weight of too many seasons. Jake pulled up near the front porch and cut the engine. "This was my father's place," he said simply. Madison looked out at the weathered building. It wasn't grand. It wasn't beautiful, but it felt more real than any penthouse suite she had ever stepped into. They spent the next few days fixing what they could. Jake repaired the rusted gutters and patched holes in the barn roof. Madison painted the front porch with broad, clumsy strokes, laughing when the wind caught her hair and smeared white across her forehead. They ate meals on the tailgate of the truck, sandwiches, cans of soup heated over an old camping stove. They slept in a room with squeaky floorboards and a mattress too thin to be luxurious, but just thick enough to feel like home. There were no plans, no deadlines, no promises beyond tomorrow. And somehow, that was enough. Meanwhile, back in the world they had left behind, the media frenzy reached a fever pitch. Reporters speculated wildly. Anonymous sources claimed Madison had suffered a mental breakdown. Others whispered about secret pregnancies, hidden scandals, fallouts with studios. Tabloids ran wild with rumors. Theories stacked up like poker chips at a casino no one could win. But Madison Brooks stayed silent. No interviews, no public statements, no explanations. The silence drove the machine crazy. Without a story to sell, the world slowly, inevitably moved on. New scandals replaced old ones. New celebrities caught the public's fleeting attention. And somewhere, beyond the reach of flashing cameras and screaming headlines, Madison and Jake built something different. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't perfect. Some mornings the roof leaked when it rained. Some days the truck refused to start without a fight. Some nights they fell asleep exhausted, smelling of sweat and paint and old wood. But every laugh, every meal shared, every glance across the messy, half-repaired rooms was real. Not curated, not polished, just real. One evening, months later, they sat on the front steps of the farmhouse, watching the sun sink behind the hills. Jake handed her a glass of lemonade, and for a long time, they just sat in the easy silence they had grown to love. Finally, Madison spoke. "I spent my whole life building something everyone else told me I should want," she said quietly. "Money, fame, power, and the whole time, all I really wanted was a life I didn't have to pretend to be happy living." Jake didn't respond right away. He just nodded, slow and thoughtful. "You built an empire," he said finally. "Now you're building something better." She smiled, turning her face toward the fading light. "Not every empire needs to be made of stone and gold. Some empires are built from mornings that start with black coffee and end with grease-stained hands, from broken fences repaired together, from promises made with actions instead of words. Some empires are built from freedom, from love that doesn't ask you to perform, from a life lived so honestly that you don't have to wonder if it's real." Madison Brooks didn't need the world's approval anymore. She had found something more valuable than fame, more lasting than wealth. She had found herself. And in the quiet corners of a forgotten farmhouse, where dreams didn't need to be broadcast or sold to be real, she found that sometimes the greatest success wasn't in being seen by millions. It was in being truly seen by just one person and seeing yourself clearly for the first time. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to today's story. We are truly grateful for your presence and attention. Every story we share carries a deeper meaning, And today's message reminds us that real success is not measured by fame or wealth, but by the authenticity of the life we choose to live. It's about finding the courage to walk away from expectations and stepping into a life that feels true to who we are. If you found value in today's story and would like to support our channel, it's very simple. Just hit the like button. Leave a comment below to let us know which country you're watching from and share your thoughts about the story. We would love to hear how it made you feel or what lessons you took away from it. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss any of our future stories. Your support helps us continue bringing meaningful content to you and others around the world. Thank you again for being a part of our community. We look forward to hearing from you and sharing many more powerful stories together.